So tonight we're going to be discussing chapter 7, which is the bane of the educational system. The educational systems the world over must be held responsible for the debacle of the intellect. Education has long been in the hands of those lacking true education. Institutions of learning have hit an all-time low. They need to be revamped. Further loss of time would lead the decadent human species to virtual extinction. So the conclusion that we have reached thus far is that there is a lack of development of the intellect. It is clear by what we are seeing unfolding in the world today. Perhaps we've not yet been able to sufficiently draw the parallel, and that's okay. Again, we're not asking you to necessarily just accept what we are presenting here. It's for your own investigation, really. What the course structure is attempting to do is for you to gain the ability so that you can think independently, so that you can draw your own conclusions without necessarily just believing what's being told because it's by some great person or because it's by some media outlet or even government for that matter. Everything requires questioning. Questioning not to disagree, but questioning to get to the bottom of a particular piece of information. Trying to figure out really what that knowledge represents. Now, from the point of view of what we're seeing in the world today, and everyone will have their own position, of course, everyone sees the world differently. But generally speaking, what we do observe is that the world's in a tricky place. I don't have to remind anyone that there's a war currently being waged. There's pandemics, terrorism. In fact, I was just reading today, there's these cells, terrorist cells that are operating within the sub-Saharan Africa of concern, not to frighten you. So we see from a macrocosmic level, the world's not at peace. It's not by any means good times, we can say. Generally speaking, again, high divorce rates, high rates of stress and depression. In fact, not only every second person I meet, even friends, colleagues, people I have known for a long time, family members, either some form of depression, some form of mental illness. Most are on sleeping pills, sleeping tablets, cannot sleep. So at the individual level, we again see things are slightly off. And this all boils down to, and what we've proved so far, is lack of intellectual discrimination, lack of intellectual development. When I say intellectual, we don't mean intelligence, as we already covered. We mean the capacity to think, reason, and judge for oneself, independent of biases. So where does this debacle come from? Why has there been this monumental fall in humans' capacity to just be able to think? We know that thinking doesn't come naturally. So in effect, thinking, constructive thought force needs to be cultivated. It needs to be developed. It needs to be learned, which means it needs to be taught. Education, therefore, lies with an education system. The education system should be in place to cultivate thinking. So we come to the conclusion then that, well, if nobody can think, nobody's learned this art, that means that the art wasn't taught. That means the responsibility then lies with the system itself. And unfortunately, and whether you subscribe to this idea or not, continuing along this trajectory, is going to further undermine our existence. It's going to further create more problems for humanity. And that's something that we cannot afford. The word educate means to draw out. Schools and universities throughout the world do not follow this basic principle of education. Knowledge has to be drawn out of students, not thrust into them. Students would need time to pause, think, analyze the information inputs to digest them. Knowledge acquired this way stays with them. It becomes their own. Again, all the italics that you see on these presentations means that it comes directly from the textbook. It's been lifted directly out of the textbook. I don't claim any of these as my own words. These are words that are drawn from the textbook that we are studying, Fall of the Human Intellect by A. Sarati. So, educate. If you look up the Latin meanings, edu and cate, it actually means to draw out, to pull it out of you, not to push it into you. It's very interesting. I conduct classes with youth, and it's actual. I don't know how much they're learning. No, they obviously, from what their parents say, it's invaluable. But I definitely learn. I'm always investigating, not prying, but investigating as to what's really going on. What's going on in their classes? What's going on with their friends? What's going on at their schools? Very interesting. And they will more or less say the same thing. No time for questions. Teachers are just saying this, and you're going to get a test on this, and then that's how we're going to go. But I have no time for questions. So what's happening is this knowledge, this information that's being conveyed in the schooling systems is being thrust upon students. If you ask any of the students, I heard you're writing a test on Monday. It's Thursday. I heard you're writing a test on Monday. How did it go? I think I did it right. What test did you write? It was maths. What was it on? It was trigonometry. Okay, tell me something about it. Blank. As soon as they leave that exam or test venue, they've forgotten everything. How many of you remember anything from school? Not only now, okay, far down the line from school, most of us, yeah. A year after you finish school, a couple months, a couple weeks. See, the way it's designed is not for you to retain that information because of the way it's being presented. Present educational systems merely focus on feeding information from extrinsic sources. Sound familiar? Intelligence, with no provision for the students to pause, reflect, and examine its intrinsic worth. Information thus imposed lasts for a while and passes away. It does not register in the students. So what's happening? Intelligence, intelligence, intelligence. No provision to pause, reflect, examine. What is this process of pausing, reflecting, examining? That is the process you need to take in order to develop the intellect. So thrust them with knowledge, thrust them with intelligence. What's that good for? We know you can get a job. What's being able to pause, reflect, examine worth? Well, that'll give you a life. That develops your capacity to meet the challenges. And that's being neglected. So we can start drawing these conclusions. So, the actual process of imparting or acquiring general knowledge, developing the powers of reasoning and judgment, and generally of preparing oneself or others intellectually for mature life. This is the definition of true education. Now you look at that definition and you start trying to superimpose that on what's happening in the current system. And by and large, now I'm not talking about these small pockets of schools that exist where perhaps this is being followed, this model is being followed. If anything, they are very small pockets. We're talking about generally, I don't know what the model is, Model C, this type of schooling system. This is what we taught across the board, certain subjects, the way that they're communicated, all of this thing. So the act or process of imparting or acquiring general knowledge, right? Developing the powers of reasoning and judgment, and preparing oneself for mature life. Now you have to ask yourself, does the education system measure up to this definition of true education? From what I can observe, from what I can see, from what many of us have observed and can see, it doesn't. Therefore, what is happening at the schools? Not a true education, that's for sure. So what we are seeing is that kids are merely given information, intelligence. And of course, again, I'm going to just highlight this. I have before, but just to make it clear, there is a room for intelligence. We're not saying go to school and don't learn anything about anything. It's just intelligence. We're not saying that. But when that intelligence foregoes the development of the intellect, this is where the problem arises. So what's happening at present? Well, kids are given a series of facts or given certain elements of information, and they're told to learn it. And then the test comes and they are told to repeat it. And if they are able to repeat it successfully, then they are pushed into the next grade. So what is education for? Just to get to the next grade. So what's grade 1 education for? Just to get to grade 2. Because if you have to redo grade 1, then you don't go to grade 2, and therefore your education is not progressing. So simply get to the next grade. And then when you finish school, what's your marks for? I know you got a high mark, you qualify for a certain subjects or certain qualifications eventually in certain various fields. High grades will get you into the sciences, applied mathematics. Low grades will allow you to take up science or not science, finance, things like that. And then what does all that university education give you? Well, at the end of the day, it really just gives you a job. So the whole education system is designed and primed people to get jobs. We're going to go into detail, so you'll be able to see how it all started. So again, and this is from experience, I've asked the kids, and they all say the same thing. Very little time is given in the classroom to questioning. As soon as someone raises their hand, it's because half the time the teachers don't know. Secondly, they've got so much intelligence, information to get through that there's no scope for this. I was educated in India. I think probably 40% of the time is like this. Information being communicated to the student directly from the teacher. The other 60% of the time, I would say even more, probably 30, 70. The other 70% of the time is our own personal reflection, discussions amongst peers, within small groups, within larger groups. This is actually where the learning takes place. And not only learning, development of your reasoning powers. This is when knowledge sticks with you. This is when it becomes part of your personality. Otherwise, it's gone. It goes straight away as you walk out that exam venue door. so does that knowledge walk out the other door. True education, therefore, requires one to draw out the knowledge from within using the intellect. That would mean educating gradually, carefully, through questioning and trying to elicit answers from the student body. A liberal use of question and answer sessions would prove the most effective way in communicating knowledge. Alvin Toffler, there's a quote by him. It says, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. Very interesting quote. We often associate illiteracy with the inability to read or write. 21st century, this is where we are. The illiterate is a person who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. You'll appreciate this process of learning, unlearning, and relearning. Is if you're interested in evolution, if you're interested in self-development, if you're interested in progress, if you are interested in getting ahead, you will need to be engaged full-time in this practice of learning, unlearning, and relearning. Otherwise, you're illiterate. You're not actually moving forward. You know, where I stay, they employ a lot of workers in the gardens and in the how would you say, the property maintenance. And a lot of them come from areas where they received very, very, very poor education. They are as if not educated. And it's easy to see what a struggle it is. Things that we take for granted, they are unable to digest or fathom, or even put into practice. It's quite sad. We're not talking about that. And you'll see these people, it's very difficult for them to progress, very difficult for them to get ahead in life, almost impossible. Now that's illiteracy. I mean, they can basic reading and writing and say that's almost illiteracy. Now, if you are unable to apply this principle of learning, unlearning, and relearning in today's context, you are as illiterate as these people are. Now, what is this learning, unlearning, and relearning? The learning, as we've already discussed, is true education, learning something. But also, you must possess within your faculties the ability to, having absorbed something and later knowing it to be incorrect, in other words, you're open to change your views. What does open to change your views mean? Open to change your views means you're open to learning new things, a better way of doing it, a fresh way of looking at it. So you may have learned something. You possess the ability to unlearn that because you deem it as being incorrect or not as efficient means of doing it, and then relearning it in a better and more proficient way. If you're able to do that, then nothing special, just literate in today's society. So merely providing information, just as we've communicated, just will build intelligence. See, even in this classroom, all I'm essentially doing is providing you with information. Information on, today it's education. So you will have the knowledge on the educational system, how it works, what are its pros and cons. It's not going to build your intellect. Only when you reflect on the ideas presented, only when you question. That's why I ask every beginning of each class, are there any questions? End of each class, are there any questions? If you have questions during, please raise your hand. That process of questioning is what will develop the intellect. And this mode of education is something that is not being applied in large. And when I say that, generally, you speak to students that are at school or university, Yeah, of course. The onus is placed on the students themselves in university settings to branch off and go and create study groups, but it's not necessarily a part of the curriculum. The school doesn't say, hey, listen, you go together and you got to discuss this. And so, often when the impetus is not there, it doesn't happen. It's not encouraged as much as it potentially should be. The idea of a university. In the late 19th century, John Henry Cardinal Newman authored a book in England entitled The Idea of a University, in which he deplored the state of then universities. The quality of education had deteriorated to an alarming level. To highlight the damage done to education, Newman had used two terms, liberal and servile, to define the right and wrong mode of education, respectively. Now, you don't need to go and read that whole book. The gist of it is what we're going to communicate now. Late 19th century, I think we're talking 1850, somewhere around there. He identified a problem that alarmed him and brought it to the authorities' attention. Where's 1850? Where are we now? How much further has the deterioration gone? So there we go. 1852, that's when he detected this problem. So in 170 years, it's not that he had detected the problem and changes were implemented. In fact, it continued on that downward trajectory. Now, these two terms are important. He uses them in this book, and he uses them to highlight this fall: servile and liberal. Now, of course, these words have a specific connotation. So whatever you perceive in your mind as servile and liberal, just put it aside for a while. We're going to define them, so then you'll know what we're talking about. He defined these terms: liberal and servile education, two modes of education. One, necessary for the promotion of true education, which we've defined. The other, what is being taken up, or at the time was being slowly infiltrating the then education systems, universities, colleges, in highly rated institutions, was slowly infiltrating the servile education. Now, one could argue it's only servile. Then it had slowly started infiltrating, which he was alarmed about, this cardinal. Now it's purely servile. Again, you shouldn't get this impression, and I keep repeating it, just so you don't gain a sort of bias. It's not that he was against any technical education or technical knowledge. Of course, that's important. More now so than ever, because we have such technical nuances and technical fields of application that it is necessary. So he's not against this. Servile education. He classifies education as servile, which has a utility tag attached to it. The thought of utility while seeking knowledge. The idea of using knowledge for any vocational, mercenary, or pecuniary purpose makes merits learning servile. Modern educational systems are saturated with the idea of utilization. So, servile education, remember, these are the two concepts that he highlighted in this book, The Idea of a University. We're going to be looking at servile education first. So what is servile education? Servile education is any education where the primary focus of that education is on the preparation for trade with financial or material benefits pertaining to money. Cashing in on knowledge, as it were. You ask your friend, hey, I heard you are studying. You got accepted in medical school. You're going to be studying to become a doctor. That's fantastic. I've got a question for you though. Yeah, sure, ask. I know it's a difficult course, and it takes a long time. But what made you take up medicine? Why do you want to be a doctor? He looks around, he says, have you not seen the cars that doctors drive? Have you not seen the places they live? The amount of money they have? Doctors are wealthy, man. Doctors are rich. Even if you work for the government, I think it's 60,000 a month. That's a good salary. What are you asking me? Why do I want a doctor? Well, a good, profitable industry. Financial, material benefits pertaining to money. In other words, there's some utility tag attached. You're doing it for a particular outcome, usually centered on monetary gain. It need not only be restricted to monetary gain. So, servile or utilitarian-based education. Now he moves on to describe liberal education. The world has lost the beauty and grandeur of liberal education, an education uncontaminated with utilitarian motives. Liberal education of any subject, even technical knowledge like engineering or medicine, is undertaken for education's sake, for mere acquiring that knowledge without the stigma of trading with it. Just study for study's sake. Acquire knowledge for knowledge's sake. Liberal knowledge is knowledge which is its own end, sufficient in itself and apart from every external and ulterior objective. A knowledge impregnated by reason. Reason is the principle of that intrinsic knowledge, which dispenses with the necessity for those possessing it to look abroad for any end to rest upon external to itself. Liberal education, and this is the words of John Henry Cardinal Newman, liberal education viewed in itself is simply the cultivation of the intellect as such, and its object is nothing more or less than intellectual excellence. I've included a quote there just to sum it up, because the paragraph before may appear a little bit confusing. Some of you may have looked at that and go, I don't know what he's talking, you've lost me here. Intrinsic knowledge and impregnated by a lot of big terms are there. We try and keep the terminology quite simple because it's more effective to be able to communicate something without getting lost in lofty sort of language, which one could argue in this paragraph is a little bit difficult to follow. So this is why we included the quote, which kind of succinctly breaks it down. So essentially what's happening is today, liberal education does not exist. Nowhere does anyone take up medicine just for medicine's sake. Now, why are you studying engineering? Oh yeah, I'm just for engineering's sake. Just interesting subject, I guess. So you don't find that in the world today. There's always engineering. I heard that they're looking for engineers in Australia and I want to get out this country. I'm going to study engineering. I know I'll get a job like that. Quick. It's the same for everyone who wants to study. I even ask family members, cousins, people that are engaged in studying university. Why are you studying this? Because I can get a job in this company. It will open doors for me to get there. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong. It's just utilitarian-based learning. Learning for servile reason with a tag attached. Now, the opposite of that is liberal education. There's no motive like that. You just want to study for the understanding of that subject. See, it's not that you got to go to some special university. You got to do some special course. It's your attitude towards the study. See, I could go and study medicine. In fact, I did. I don't use myself as an example, but same thing, medicine. Friend says, well, why are you studying medicine? You know, John told me his reasons. I mean, he wants money. He wants to drive a nice car and live in a nice house. Why are you studying it? Oh, I just find it fascinating. I mean, the body, it's remarkable. Always been interested in learning about how it all works, how the synergy exists between the various systems within it. Fascinating, fascinating. And that's not to say that that guy is not going to qualify to become a doctor and potentially practice medicine. It's not that. But his whole attitude towards the reason he's studying it is different. I'll ask you, which guy are you going to let treat you at the end of the day? No, I don't need to hear the answer. It's very obvious. The problem is, guaranteed, most of your doctors fall in the first category. Most doctors. Why is the world in such a poor state of health? Not because there's a lack of doctors, because the reason, the methodology behind why they're studying is completely off. Someone said to me, well, medical institutions don't produce doctors anymore. They produce script writers. These people that just write scripts. Usually whatever the drug companies are pushing onto them. Anyway, that's a different discussion. So when a person is liberally educated, see, it's not that they're not learning the subject. They're still learning. I'm going to keep it to the same example, medicine. They're still learning medicine, right? But while they're learning medicine, because of the process which they're engaging in other words, learning for learning's sake, they want to get to the depth of it, to the bottom of it, how it works. That person is at the same time developing his or her capacity to think, to function. That person may not get a job in the medical industry, but that guy will still be employable. Wow. Liberally educated. He's got an intellect. He can think for himself. You can take him and put him anywhere. See, it's not difficult to learn something. Anyone can do that. But to find a man who can think, needle in a haystack. So liberal education, as Cardinal Newman defines, is nothing but developing the intellect. It is demeaning, nay, vulgar, to look at education as a wealth creation process. Nevertheless, Education Secretary in the British Cabinet, Charles Rodway Clarke, believed that universities should justify state funding through their benefits to the national economy doing battle in the global market. Had Clarke, the guardian of educational resources in England, been liberally educated, he would have perceived the danger, in Oscar Wilde's words, of the man knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing. So this was some time back when the book was written, but at the time, Charles Rodway Clarke was the Education Secretary. And basically, the gist of his presentation, his speech, was that universities will get funding from the government, provided that they produce, well, that they engage with students and produce people for the workplace. In other words, if you are leaning on liberal education, we are going to be pulling your funding. You appreciate it. Universities rely heavily on government funding. If you are going to be gearing your syllabuses towards liberal education, the arts, humanitarian studies, all of those things, we're pulling out your education. Sorry, pulling out your funding. In other words, they drove this servile education doctrine, drove it. Of course, no university can function without funding. We know that. So this is the predicament they find themselves in. Knowledge versus wisdom. Sorry, before I continue, is everyone okay? Is everyone clear on these two ideas? Liberal versus servile education. Sorry, the lighting is slightly distracting. I apologize. Okay, great. Thanks, Amanda. Right, so we'll carry on. Knowledge versus wisdom. A person gains knowledge as he acquires information from external sources. The world is replete with information hunters, knowledge seekers, who merely gather thoughts and ideas from others and become well-informed on one or more subjects. They become storehouses of knowledge with little capacity to convert it to any practical use of their own. People find it difficult, if not impossible, to live by the knowledge they acquired. So you have people on one hand simply accumulating knowledge, gathering a lot of information. You probably met these people. They know so much about everything. Not in an egoistic way. They just read a lot. They get a lot of access to information. And they become informed very well informed on a subject, or somewhat well informed on many subjects. Mere storehouses of knowledge, like the hard drive on your computer. It's just storing information. You'll appreciate your hard drive got nothing to do with the operating of your machine. All the information you stored is not going to help you operate your life. So people, what happens is they acquire all this knowledge, and as we unearthed last class, they're unable to use it. It becomes as useful as gold on a mule's back. Human beings face this perennial problem of knowing many things, but unable to implement them in life. They have the knowledge, but not the wisdom to graft it into their living. This has been the cry of many great souls. Rabindranath Tagore, being one of them, says, "The world is full of sound scholars, but not sound men." Practically everyone knows the right from wrong, good from bad. You understand what course of action you should adopt in life and what to avoid. Yet you would knowingly choose the wrong path, detrimental to you, and abstain from what you know is rightful and beneficial. This paradoxical behavior arises when your knowledge has not matured into wisdom. So again, knowledge, just information that you acquire and acquire. Wisdom is the practical aspect that enables you to live that particular knowledge. So you could gain the knowledge of a particular value, let's say. You could simply just store that knowledge. That knowledge could be, it pays to be an unselfish person. You store it. You say to others, yeah, you know, if you want a peaceful life, it's in your interest to be unselfish. Yet you continue to act in a selfish way. That knowledge does not go through a conversion process. It's not converted into wisdom. So you can't live it. So it's useless. It's a storehouse. So with knowledge, you understand and appreciate whatever, so many things, while wisdom enables you to live by it. It is essential, therefore, to convert your knowledge into wisdom. You can do it by the process of reflection, known as manana. That's a Sanskrit word. It means reflection. Your intellect must conjugate, reflect over and over upon the knowledge acquired until you digest, absorb it, make it your own. So going back, he says that everyone knows what's right and wrong, right? Deep down, you know what's right to do and you know what's wrong things to do. Of course, they're not the same for everybody, depending on your moral position, your value system will go to determine right and wrong. But everyone would appreciate and know that it's wrong to do certain things and it's right to do other things. But we often find ourselves not being able to live up to those values which we hold on to. We have a value system that we prize ourselves on, and often we feel we fall short of the mark. So how do we lift ourselves to be able to live those values that we hold so dear? It's only through this process of manana, reflection, conjugating, going over and over those ideas again and again. Whether it's your own independent contemplation and reflection on these truths, or you may wish to engage in it by attending the classes and listening again and again. It gives it, there is some inbuilt reflection in that over and over again. If you hear it enough times, slowly, slowly, it starts seeping into your system until, as the Englishman says, the penny drops. When the penny drops, then you're able to live that value. You will do the right thing all the time. So simply hearing or reading something does not mean you can actually live those values. See, if it was as easy as that, all it would mean is that we would just take a lot of information and keep on digesting information. Oh, did you hear this? Yeah, I've heard that before. See, a lot of the time when I start talking about the subject, and my colleagues the same, they start communicating Vedanta, people go, oh yeah, we've heard that, we've heard that. And that's great. In fact, Vedanta is everywhere. Anything that is truth is Vedanta, essentially. They're given a name. Truth of life, that's Vedanta. No, I've heard that, Craig. Great. Are you living that? Are you living that principle? Are you living that example? Again, I must question my own self when I'm communicating these values. Can you live those values? Of course, these are high, lofty values. It's impossible. Now, I'd be a perfect individual if I was living all these higher values. It would be perfect. I must be aware where my shortfalls are, what I need to do to get to that point where I am living those values. The route to get there is through this process of reflection. Reflect on the values learned, reflect on the knowledge gained, whatever it is you want to achieve. Whatever value you want to imbibe, you will need to engage in this process of reflection. The world has been ignorant of the significant distinction between intelligence and intellect, the difference between mere storage of knowledge procured from others and the development of one's ability to think, judge, and decide. Educational institutions everywhere commit the blunder of merely providing knowledge without attempting to develop the fallen intellect. The problem is that they do not realize the need to rehabilitate the intellect. The governments of the world must recognize their emergent obligation to develop, strengthen the intellect by reconstituting the present educational system. So just offering a solution. The solution, obviously, to the problem. If the problem is the educational institutions, there's a solution obviously lies within the educational institutions controlled by government. So again, we have to lean on government to change the system, to change the institutions. Albert Einstein says, we cannot solve our deep problems with the same thinking that brought us these problems. It's so true. You're trying to solve the problem that you got into in the first place with your limited capacity of thinking. See, that's often one of the recourses we have. Often people say to me, yeah, okay, we understand and appreciate that developing the intellect takes some time, and perhaps my intellect is of not such a great quality. I'm not saying poor, but it's not so great. What do I do in the meantime? I'm engaging, I'm reflecting, I'm trying to develop my intellect. What can I do in the meantime to get out of the situation, to get out of the problem I'm faced with? And one of the recourses you have to is consult someone with a higher intellect. See, someone with a higher intellect, someone who you deem has a higher intellect, can get you out of the problem. Because his thinking is slightly better than yours. Sometimes even just getting an objective view on the situation is helpful enough. But solving other people's problems is always easier than solving your own. Swadharma, yet another important facet of education is the student's choice of his field of learning. The choice must be based on his inherent nature, innate bent known as vasanas. Each student, like any other human being, has distinct vasanas, which define his individuality. From an early age, the vasanas manifest in a student as a clear tendency, a definite inclination. Such tendency, inclination arising from his vasanas is said to be his swadharma. Swa means one's own, dharma means nature. A student must necessarily choose a subject in accordance with his swadharma. His life's course would then be smooth, progressive. So when we look at swadharma, often is the case with youth, they're looking for some direction. What should they study? What direction should their lives take? And one of the advices often given is do something that is aligned to your nature. Because in doing something that is aligned to your nature, it creates a freedom of growth. When you're doing something that's not aligned to your nature, there's a restriction. It prevents growth. So where possible, you will need to take up some work, some field of activity that is in accordance with your nature. Now I say where it's possible. Sometimes this is not always the case. You just need a job to make ends meet. Nah, I don't think I'm going to be doing that. That's not in line with my nature. Your nature will then be living on the pavement. You understand? So that's why I say where possible. So perhaps you, during the day, you engage in a form of activity that pays the bills, but some attention, some time must be given to cultivating those areas of your interest. If you are to have that sense of leading a fulfilled life. Now, the opposite of that, he calls us paradharma, alien nature. Anything alien to one's own nature is called paradharma. Para means alien and dharma, nature. If one chooses a course which is paradharma, his passage in life would be rugged, retarded. Swadharma versus paradharma. So of course we understand swadharma, one's own nature, paradharma, something against your nature or another's nature. It is important for a student to follow his swadharma and avoid paradharma. Swadharma activity in one's life acts like a tailwind to an aircraft, while paradharma as a headwind. Not realizing this, people make the mistake of choosing a paradharma course. So in ignorance, they don't realize this retarding force that paradharma has. It's simple, the way it's conveyed here. You're flying an aircraft. If the wind's behind you, what's your passage going to be like? Well, you get to your destination easier. You're burning less fuel. You get there quicker. It's a no-brainer. Any person flying an aircraft or sailing a ship would want a tailwind. No one looks for a headwind because it makes the course that much more difficult. You use more petrol. It takes you longer to get there. Parents and teachers have a duty and responsibility to help students locate each one's individual nature and talent. Swadharma, essentially, at an early age. Thereafter, encourage them to pursue that particular line. The educational institutions must play a significant role in this exercise. Lastly, we're going to talk about the 3 mental temperaments, in the context of education. So every human being is made up of these three mental temperaments or textures. Tamas, Rajas, Sattva, which equates to inactive, active, or trance-active. One way to look at them is three different grades. Tamas, low grade; Rajas, medium grade; Sattva, highest grade. 1, 2, 3. Tamas is a state of thoughts in inertia, when the mind is lethargic, indolent, indifferent, indisposed to activity, a mood of sloth and sleep, lacking intellectual or emotional manifestation. A person replete with tamas lives a dull, inactive life with hardly any response to the world. So I said tamas is the lowest state. Reading this, anyone can appreciate. State of lethargic. He doesn't want to do anything, doesn't want to go anywhere, not interested. There's no progress, there's no progression. Stuck. Impossible to move. Typical example, like couch potato. Just sits there all day, surrounded by rubbish. Sloth. Rajas. Now this is the second grade, slightly higher than tamas. Rajas is a state of passionate and agitated thoughts. When a person is rushing, hurrying, worrying with desire-ridden activities and is attached and involved in the affairs of the world. Like a chicken without a head, always busy, running, rushing, running, doesn't know why. It's just got all these desires to fulfill and runs around trying to fulfill them all. These people, you see them, they're highly agitated, always stressed, something to stress about. I got to be here, I got to be there, got to pick this. Rajas. Sattva. Now, sattva, the highest state. Sattva is a state of mind in equanimity, serenity, when a person remains poised, mature, contemplative, and objective, detached from worldly involvement and excitement. This is the state of a mature individual. A complete, a perfect individual would be highly sattvic. Their minds are equanimous. They are poised, contemplative, and not involved in the world. Doesn't mean they're not acting in the world. They're participating, but not involved, detached in a way. Now, what we have to appreciate is everybody is made up of these three things. Sattva, Rajas, we've got all three in us, different proportions. Sattva, Rajas, and tamas, composed in different proportions, accounts for the heterogeneous variety of human beings. It is the proportion of their combination that makes humans distinct and different from one another. Why are we all different? Because of the different proportion of sattva, rajas, tamas, these mental temperaments. So you may find a person that's 80% sattva, 10% rajas, 10% tamas. One person. Another person maybe 40, 50, 10. Another person 20, 20, 60. And all the decimals included. So you can imagine there's unlimited combinations, permutations, which is why there's 7 billion or 8 billion different people on the planet, different mental temperaments. Study, reflection, writing, and more particularly contemplation and meditation are best accomplished in the early hours of the morning between 6 a.m. 6 p.m. 4 a.m. Let me say that again. Best accomplished in the early hours of morning between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. It is known as sattvic time. So when is your sattvic nature most likely to surface? Between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. That early time in the morning. You'll find a person who's got a high sattvic content, catapulted out of bed. He just gets up at that time. High sattva in him. More sattva. Because his personality resonates with that time. You'll find there's no quieter time in the day. Between 4 and 6, nothing's happening yet. There's a peace to it. There's an air of contemplation. You're thoughtful during that time. For any of you who haven't tried it, I would highly recommend it. For the last 12 years, bar a couple days here and there, I've had the privilege of enjoying this time, 4 a.m., 6 a.m. Those times I missed it. It felt like the day was a write-off. You may go, oh, this guy was making sense until now. He's going to get up at 4 in the morning. Subject time. Now, why is it so important? Because remember, we just talked earlier about this process of reflection and contemplation, how you can convert knowledge into wisdom. If you want the practical application of Vedanta, this is it. There's no other way. Converting knowledge into wisdom is the process of reflection and contemplation. When is it best to do this? In sattvic time, that time which is most conducive to study, reflection, contemplation, absorption of knowledge, converting it into wisdom. You can try it at any other time of the day. It's far less effective. I've tried. I can honestly say it is far less effective. The law of nature is that sattva, the sattvic nature of a person, surfaces early in the morning between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. His rajas and tamas lie low in that period. After the sattvic time is over, rajas rises to the surface, while the other two remain dormant. Rajas predominates during the day from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. and tamas props up at night from 6 p.m. to 4 a.m. The law holds good for one and all. So you may observe this in nature in the morning, get up between 4 and 6, quiet. Nothing is stirring, not even the birds are chirping. Then you find that as soon as 6 starts coming, between 6 and 8, hub of activity. Everyone rushing around doing stuff. This is when rajas is manifesting. Then in the evening, that indolent time. Why do you think even talented drunkards will say, you want a drink? No, let's wait for sundown. Sundowners after 6. See, it's after 6 now. The drinkers will be outside pouring their first drinks. And then that's why all this nefarious activities start: gambling, late night partying. It's all that tamas manifesting. 6 p.m. to the next morning. That's when tamas manifests. Now, it goes without saying, if you want to reduce your tamas, this is to evolve spiritually, you want to reduce your tamas and increase your sattva. Most logical thing to do? Go to sleep early. Since education relates to one's sattvic temperament, it would produce the best results if undertaken as early in the day as possible. Individual reflection and assimilation must necessarily fit in between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. That cannot be relegated to any other time. The idea may sound revolutionary, but there is no other way to promote true education. Students need to be liberally educated in mathematics, science, classical literature, and Vedanta philosophy. That would enable them to develop a strong intellect. The educational authorities should provide and promote these subjects in schools and universities, and ensure a minimum level of proficiency in them is acquired by the students without violating their swadharma choices of study. So again, mathematics, science, classical literature, philosophy, all these have in common is it's fertile ground. It's a conducive atmosphere for the application of the intellect. These subjects lend themselves to thinking. You got to apply yourself. Anyone ever done a math problem? You got to really sit there and figure it out. Get those intellectual cogs turning. If you're able to engage in these subjects, these are the best subjects to do if you want to develop your intellect. Obviously, it's not limited to these subjects. If you're not interested in them, obviously, it's not just Dharma. There's still scope for developing the intellect. But these would prove very, very helpful. Once you're able to develop your intellect, you're set.